Good morning, everyone. I wanted to start with our classic schoolhouse rock song, Approach to Legislation, because that is our topic today, is talking about legislation generally, and then particularly climate heritage legislation. I expect I am dating myself, full Gen Xer here. This is one of the ways, Schoolhouse Rock is one of the ways that I learned about how legislation becomes a law. And so as we just saw, it's how a poor little roll of a bill makes its way up to the Capitol building and the route that he or it takes through committees and votes to become eventually, hopefully, a law. And what I really wanted to point out with this, and here's another, I did searching for all kinds of cartoons of the process. This is one of the best ones. All of these steps on Capitol Hill, they absolutely matter. Ideas do not become laws without them. But the piece that I really want to work through with us today is that these are not the only steps and parts of the process that matter. And so to talk about this more, I want to put our little bill on a timeline so that we can explore them. And what we're going to say is, there's the whole part before the bill happens. In the video, there was the group of people meeting with their congressman. This is that part. And this is where people, a group of people, us potentially, identify a problem, say what it is we're seeing as an issue, and we figure out a vision that we want to solve it, and figuring out steps of what's needed for that solution. On the right side is the implementation side, figuring out and ensuring that the bill is implemented, and then really doing some of that tracking. Is the bill creating the desired outcome? Are adjustments needed? Potentially, eventually, we might even need other legislation to do what we think we need to do. To give some examples of the complexity of this, of how it all works, I'm going to give us some examples. For example, I think as we all know, there's the scientific finding that smoking raises the risk of cancer. And a corresponding vision of that is fewer, potentially no, people doing smoking. But a key question is, when you think about this in terms of legislation, is how do you do that? Do you ban it? Do you tax it? Do you figure out other regulations? Do you put warnings on it? Do you do education? What is the step that will actually work? And then not only do you need steps that will actually work, of course, there's the bill. You need a how that's going to get through all those congressional committees and that the president can agree on and sign. Where we've landed now, particularly for smoking, is a combination of tax, regulations, education, some of which is at local levels, and is a solution that has developed over time. Didn't all happen at once. Now, just to swap out some of our problems, of course, we're now facing the problem of rising greenhouse gas emissions that are causing global warming, which is climate change. And in a sense, it's a similar question to tobacco, where our vision is eliminating emissions from reaching the atmosphere. To get to that vision, we have a similar question that came up with tobacco. How? Do we ban them? Do we tax them? Do we do other regulations? Do we rely on technology? Do we try behavior change? What is the set of steps that will work for this? And of course, as we all know, the who here, getting a solution that will work through congressional committees and that the president can agree on is a key part of this. Where we have landed in the present is it's a work in progress. The how that has made it through a who so far is support for new technology and some regulations. Now, this arrangement also works for archaeology. And so that's where we're going to move now. And I'm going to turn our little timeline. We're going to make our timeline do double duty here. So in 1906, the Antiquities Act was passed as an outcome of efforts that started in the late 19th century to stop the looting of archaeological sites and pueblos in the American Southwest. And the real vision was to stop this looting. That was the whole goal. May severity was a particular concern, so that's our representative here. Now, this is the text of the Antiquities Act of 1906. It's actually quite a short bill. And what it does is it gives the President of the United States the authority to declare historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest as national monuments, essentially draw a boundary around them, and then withdraw them from development and daily life as an effort to protect them. Now, over time, the Antiquities Act has become a major tool that presidents use for conservation. And just earlier this month, President Biden used the Antiquities Act to expand the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument and the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument as part of his efforts to meet his goals of 30% conservation of land area by 2030. It's also called the America the Beautiful Initiative. The conservative forces are starting to object to this, as they do, calling it a power grab. But the point, we could go into what the original text said and how it's being used, but the key point I want to make here is essentially the Antiquities Act started with the vision of stopping looting of archaeology, and it's become this much bigger tool that presidents use. And a key part of this is to acknowledge that while it's become this much bigger thing, that is now some tension between what it was originally written to do and how it is currently being used at the presidential level, is that it never actually really stopped looting. And in 1979, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act was passed with some new provisions to try to actually get at the issue of looting. And what it does is it makes some forms of looting, actually assigns them criminal penalties. Now, in another example, the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act can be seen to have gone sort of in the opposite direction. Now, the energy to pass the National Historic Preservation Act really came out of the recognition in the late 1950s and 1960s that urban renewal and the construction of the US interstate highway system was really taking out the historic cores of a lot of towns and cities. And so there is a vision to create a process to consider heritage before the bulldozers take them out. And I'm going to show you, this is the opening section of the National Historic Preservation Act. It's much, much longer than the Antiquities Act. And just very briefly, this is a pretty big vision. This actually doesn't even talk specifically about bulldozers. It really sets an idea that the historical and cultural foundation of the nation should be preserved as a living part of community. It really sets the idea that heritage should be a very integral and engaged part of American life. Now, one of our big questions that we should be asking is, has the National Historic Preservation Act had this effect? Are we seeing this outcome? Or is there more work that needs to be done to achieve this? Another example from very recently, the chair of the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, Sarah Bronin, just recently put out an op-ed in The Hill saying that federal regulations for heritage and historic preservation, such as the National Register of Historic Places and the Section 106 process, while they started with that really big vision, they've actually been applied and implemented much more narrowly. They've become much more conservative, with the state of practice really emphasizing keeping things just as they are and actually making it difficult to do development, to do things that need to be done. And so in a sense, she has said it's gone in this direction. I say I was in the CRM world before I came to Washington, D.C., and a lot of what she says sort of rings true. It's not every project and it's not every client, but there's a pressure from developers, particularly, to not be creative, to do the least amount possible, and so forth. And I think there's some folks with some CRM experience on the call, and so I'll be curious in our conversation to see if this also registers with them. So anyway, you can have a big vision. Well, you can have a narrow vision with the Antiquities Act and it can become big, and you can have with the NHPA a very big vision that appears, at least in some respects, to have become smaller. So I want to pull these together to talk about how we think about a way to present a way in which we can think about and review legislation. Now, first task is sort of as we started. what's our before part? What is our understanding of an issue? How do we see a problem? And how do we sort of see and phrase and describe what the issue is that we want to solve? Then, what is our vision? What do we want to see as the outcome? What do we want to see as the solution to that problem? Particularly evaluation. How will we know if this outcome has been achieved? And then, given all that we know about the problem and our vision, what specific steps do we recommend, do we see as needed to get to that outcome? Now, over this current year, in my work with SHA, I want to put this question to all of you. What is NAHAR's and HARC's and SHA's approach to issues in archaeology and climate? What do we see as our major issues? What is our vision for the outcomes? And what steps do we see as needed to get there? So I'm going to plant the seed and we'll come back to this question at the end. Because it's always good to know what you want, and that helps you review other pieces of legislation. So I want you to keep these questions in mind, and then I'm just going to turn this into a bit of a template for how to review legislation. When you approach any piece of legislation, you should go through a similar set of steps. First, just ask, what is the problem or issue that the legislation is addressing? How have they framed it? What do they see as the problem? What is the vision for its outcome? And how and who will be evaluating its outcome? And then what steps are proposed to get from the problem to the outcome, and do these seem reasonable and appropriate? And why it's always good to know what your vision is, you also have the opportunity to compare. Does this issue, steps, and outcome compare with your vision of what is needed? I'm thinking most of us on this call have experience with peer review. And this is a slightly different process. It's close, but not exactly the same. In peer review, the role is really to review what the author has written, the evidence they've brought together, and the conclusions they've reached. And I'm expecting most of us have had the experience of having a peer reviewer who tries to throw in their perspective, like, well, I just really think you should reframe the question. I just think it should do this. And they go way outside their role as peer reviewer. They should just really point out the gaps, but not reframe the article as they would have written it. For legislation, we can bring that larger vision to say, well, wait a minute, this is framing the problem like this, but we see the problem as this. It's framing this outcome, but we also want to see this outcome. It's suggesting these steps, but we think these pieces are also needed. You can think bigger when you're reviewing legislation. Okay, with all of this in mind, let's turn to some new existing legislation. The piece we're going to be looking at and thinking about is HR 7936, which is called the Cultural Resources Challenge Act of 2024. It was introduced on April 10th of this year by Representative Paul Tonko, Democrat, representing the 20th District of the state of New York. On April 18th, I had the chance to meet with Tonko's staff, and they conveyed that, yes, this bill has been introduced and it has been referred to its first committee, the House Committee on Natural Resources, but it does not yet have co-sponsors. And currently, especially with the election coming up and other political issues underway, they are not expecting this bill to move through any further steps at this point. What they've said is their act in introducing this bill is that that they want it to be the start of a conversation. So that means there is space for us to bring together our vision and share our thoughts on this legislation, both what it does, what it doesn't do, and where we would want it to go. Now I'm going to take our timeline again, and we're going to start on the left side with some of the background on the bill. And there are two major inputs that I know of, so I'm going to share those with you. One of them is my input, particularly some issues that I raised in response to the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. And the second is some work that the National Parks Conservation Association has been doing. They've been advocating on behalf of the National Park Service. So I'm going to start with some background on my part. And I realize some of you on the call, it's been a while since I've seen you or talked with you about some of the work that I've been doing. So just briefly, part of the work that I have done over recent years is that for 7 years, I was with the National Park Service as their climate change adaptation coordinator. And what this means is I was really their first person to hold the role of figuring out what climate change was going to mean for all of the cultural resources that the Park Service manages and for which it provides guidance. Did a lot of interagency coordination, building up research and so forth, and really figuring out impacts and then adaptation. This included policy and communication approaches as well. I was in this role from 2011 through late 2018. So with that is, so I've seen it, and I will mention this in a moment. Part of that, I was part of the Park Service climate change response program, but I was the cultural person for that. So give you more detail on that in a moment. So in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and it is currently referred to as the largest climate change bill in the US so far. Now, most of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act focus on renewable energy. It's developing electric vehicles, improving the grid, doing all of those sorts of things to the tune of several $100 billion. But there is a section close to the end of the bill under the heading of natural resources that directs close to $1 billion to the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management for, quote, the conservation, protection, and resiliency of land and resources. And this includes $500 million to the Park Service to hire employees. Nothing in these provisions of the bill and in any of the other sources that I know to check, because I was with the Park Service for that many years, has suggested that anyone at the Park Service or in Congress is expecting any of that money to be used for cultural resources. Not a penny. And there's certainly no plan for it. So what I wrote, I was and am very concerned about this. So I wrote an op-ed in October of 2022. And very briefly, this is what this said. It said, cultural resources is essentially invisible in US response to climate change. Cultural resources are also essentially invisible in popular understandings of the Park Service. Cultural resources have unique qualities that shape both how they're affected by climate change and what they provide to climate change response. The NPS had an internationally recognized program for cultural resources, climate change, that was silenced under the previous administration. That was me. Cultural resources and heritage have roles in climate change that extend far beyond parks, including environmental justice, loss and damage, and conflict and peace building. And federal capacity for cultural heritage and climate change should be rebuilt to address all of these. So in brief, putting this on our timeline, here are the problems that I saw. The vision that I have is that federal capacity for cultural heritage and climate change should be rebuilt to address all of these. And the methods that I suggested, and these were published not fully in the op-ed because that was quite short, but what I have suggested in some other publications is that we need a study of interagency climate heritage needs. There should be a named Federal Heritage Climate Coordination Office. We should build climate heritage capacity for communities and beyond federal property, and there should be some NPS accountability. Now, in January of 2023, Tonko's office reached out to me and asked what legislation is needed to follow up on my op-ed, which was such a great question to be asked. And I have been in conversation with them about this legislation ever since. And my understanding has always been that our conversations about all the issues that I raised in the op-ed were part of their inspiration in thinking about writing a major bill for cultural resources, and that this became the Cultural Resources Challenge Act. But my work has not been the only influence here. There have been other interests and other people that they've been consulting. So that's what I'm going to turn to next. The actual name has some history. It's called the Cultural Resources Challenge Act. And this is because in 1999, the National Park Service itself put out a call for funding that it called the Natural Resources Challenge. And in this, the Park Service itself requested $100 million to support natural resources programs at the Park Service. I will point again, this funding call was promoted by the NPS director. It was specifically for natural resources. It asked for $100 million. And what the Park Service received was $77.5 million that was distributed and appropriated between 2000 and 2007. This was considered quite a success. and it had measurable outcomes. Now, in 2008, the National Academy of Public Administration did a study of natural resources versus cultural resources funding and staffing across the Park Service. Baseline conditions I will mention, they estimated 2/3 of all national park units were established for the explicit purpose of conserving cultural resources, and all national park units hold cultural resources regardless of why the park was founded. And the Park Service is responsible for those cultural resources because it is a national park unit. So just keep that in mind as we look at these numbers. What they found is that in 1995, natural resources and cultural resources funding was relatively equal, and natural resources and cultural resources staffing was relatively equal. That doesn't mean it was commensurate with the responsibilities they had, but they were roughly equal in numbers. By 2008, natural resources funding had increased 71%, and cultural resources funding had declined 19%. Natural resources staffing had increased 31.2%, and cultural resources staffing had decreased 27.2%. Now, in 2009 to 2010, the Natural Resources Program established its Climate Change Response Program. And this is the program that I work for. And what I always heard while I was there is that it was the funding from the Natural Resources Challenge that funded that program. So I know we've talked previously about long divisions between natural resources and cultural resources and how this affects our programs for climate change. And I expect that the tendency to identify climate change as being a natural resources and hard physical sciences issue played a role in this. But with the Park Service, some of it was also the existence of that funding and staffing. The Natural Resources Program had a body of funding, it had a number of staff, and it said, let's put the climate change program here. What you're also seeing here is a map of the climate change response program just at about the time that I left my role. The green circles are people with primary responsibilities, roles, and training in natural resources. The person circled in orange is me in cultural resources. It was a ratio at best of 1:8 and sometimes lower. So this is what raised my concern when I was looking at the Inflation Reduction Act and the amount of money that was being directed to the Park Service. If this amount of divergence between natural resources and cultural resources happened with $77.5 million, what happens when $500 million is put on this without a clear and well-articulated plan for balance or rebalancing? Hence my op-ed. Now, in 2012, the Park Service Cultural Resources Program did put out a Cultural Resources Challenge document. I was part of some of these discussions. Some key points I will note is it was a document that came with no financial ask. And for those of you who are government aware, if 2011, 2012 sounds familiar, this is around the time of the Tea Party, and there were major budget issues. There was something called sequestration. There were a number of government shutdowns and so forth. So this was part of the, we're not asking for any money, we will do more with less, which feels like it's a constant in the cultural resources world. I will also note this was not promoted by the MPS director. An ask for it was included in 2016 as part of the Park Service budget request. And I think this was part of the centennial celebration because Park Service was founded in 1916, but no funding was received for this. One other piece of this, in 2022, the National Academies of Public Administration released another report in late 2022 that also looked at Park Service Cultural Resources Program. It used some different data, and I will not go into all of the specifics here. I just wanted to point out this one concerning things that should I think concern us all, and it should frame how we think about this bill. It recommended to the Cultural Resources Program that they should make sure that their priorities fit within larger NPS goals, such as the director's goals. Now, this is a really odd statement because cultural resources are part of the National Park Service. The Park Service, under the National Historic Preservation Act and the 1935 Historic Sites Act, is the lead federal agency for cultural resources. every park as in the national park system, as we said, has cultural resources in it. How can there be a situation in which the priorities and needs of the cultural resources program are not priorities of the Park Service? And so one of the questions that we should be thinking about is, what is this disconnect between cultural resources and the whole of the National Park Service? Finally, we get to the National Park Service Conservation Association. Yes, they have put out a document that they call the Cultural Resources Challenge for the National Park Service. And what they do is they ask for $250 million. They put a specific financial ask. They request 450 cultural resources staff. They specifically ask for a cultural resources inventory and monitoring program. I will add here, there's already a natural resources inventory and monitoring program. They're asking for a separate one for cultural resources, and then a range of basic operating support. Okay, what does the bill actually say? I'm not going to take you through all the specific language, but I've pulled out some of the key sections. Section 1 is title. Section 2 is what they call the Cultural Resources Challenge, and it essentially asks for support for a range of basic cultural resources program functions. 3, it is what it calls the Resilience Challenge Grant Program. It's planning grants, program grants, and project grants for external applicants. And topics include baseline data and digitization, as well as climate response and storytelling. Section 4, establishing an NPS Career Academy for cultural resources. 5 is a requirement for the Park Service to report to Congress on actions taken under this act 2 years after enactment. And Section 6 is a requirement for State of our Cultural Resources report 4 years after enactment from the Park Service in collaboration with the ACHP, funding request of $250 million. So I'm going to put this on our timeline. Problem that the CR Challenge Act, as it is currently phrased, is to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the semi-quincentennial of the United States. And its vision is to protect and sustain the resiliency of our nation's cultural resources for the enjoyment, well-being, and education of all present and future generations, with the evaluation of 2 reports from the NPS. How it will do this is support for basic NPS CR operating steps, funding the external grant program, and funding an NPS CR Career Academy. For our reference, these are the Rockman steps that I had put out, and these are the NPCA steps. Just for comparison, what you can see is neither of us got all the things that we wanted. NPCA got more than I did. So thinking about reviewing, and just from the range of things that we have talked about, I'm going to just add some additional commentary that I know to add to these pieces, as I'll note them here, is support for NPS cultural resources operating steps. One of the big questions that I have is, how does this support relate to the IRA funding, to the Inflation Reduction Act funding? Is this essentially tacit recognition that all of that funding that's going to the Park Service is not going to cultural resources? Or if some of that is going to cultural resources, how do these relate and how will these be aligned? Because $250 million, it's a reasonable chunk of money, but wow, it's not the same amount of funding that's coming from the natural resources, from the Inflation Reduction Act, on top of the previous Natural Resources Challenge divergences. There's funding the external grant programs. This is where I just have questions about NPS expertise, priorities, and particularly climate-ready guidance. As ACHP Chair Bronin noted, there are some issues with current regulations and how they are implemented. So if there's a grant program to address a number of things, but the regulations that we currently have don't address those, how will those be aligned? And then finally, they say fund an NPS CR Career Academy. This is something I can tell you, I think Laura Seifert may know as well. There have been multiple career academies over time. I know particularly there was one that was just being developed at the point at which I left. So I'm just going to ask the question is, why is a new one needed now? What have problems been previously? Why should there be, why is additional funding for a new one identified now? And then finally, I have 2 more questions to add here, is we should be asking questions about evaluation. I've asked some questions about accountability. If the vision is for the nation's cultural resources, something that everyone enjoys, that's something quite big, is reporting from the Park Service alone going to be sufficient to identify that this is working? And I think we should also be asking the question, as I was saying, where is the NPS director and NPS values for cultural resources in all of this? If the NPCA, an external group, had to put out this challenge call, where is the support coming for them to do all of these things? And what is the environment in which these will all be taking place? So that's my approach to the Cultural Resources Challenge Act. We now have two ideas or questions in front of us. First is the Sierra Challenge Act now exists. It's been introduced, and the congressional office that has introduced it has said very clearly they would welcome a conversation. They want it to start to be a conversation. So we have a question in front of us. How do we want to be part of this conversation? Is there a response that we would like to make? Do we have ideas about it? Are there more questions we would like to ask? Are there other things we would like to see? How would we like to approach this act? How would we like to review it? Write letters, op-eds, or so forth. And then second is our really big vision, both with this legislation in mind or more broadly. What do we see as NAHAR and HARC and SHA? What are the other big issues that we see? How do we phrase our problems? What is the vision we want to get to? And what specific steps do we want to see happening? So with this, I want to leave this slide up for a bit, and I'm going to stop sharing my, I'm going to leave it up for a moment, but I really want to open the floor for questions and discussions. And thank you so much for listening to all of this. I can see that some comments have been showing up in the chat, but I haven't had the chance to see them. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for listening, and I welcome questions that you might have.